Hey everybody, it's Gail and this is Errata-Hate, and today I need to talk to you about my vintage pattern problem. So my vintage pattern problem is that I have a vintage pattern problem, by which I mean that I've got like 70 patterns saved on my Google Drive that I've either found for free on Free Vintage Crochet or I found on Etsy through a few different stores. I also have over 300 patterns saved on my Etsy to just buy over time. And then I haven't finished going through Free Vintage Crochet to get all of those patterns. And the thing about vintage patterns is that there are some difficulties in working with them that aren't seen in a lot of modern patterns. And I thought it would be interesting to talk about that in case you're also interested in vintage patterns. So, first of all, the thing that makes me love vintage patterns is I really like the look of a lot of the styles I'm finding from about the 1930s to into the 70s, including a few things from the 80s that I found that were really cute. The big thing for me when it comes to anything, in terms of if it's clothing, if it's crocheting, is that I have a very large bust. I'm a 30 double G, that comes out to about a 42-inch bust, and that is not an easy to dress bust, especially as someone who has a bit of an hourglass figure, and so I like my clothes to nip in at the waist so that you can tell I have one and I'm not all boobs. Also, I have a very short torso, so my boobs look even bigger. And so I always look at crochet patterns, looking for a gauge, looking for a certain shape to the clothes, so that I can really fit them in my body when I want to. And there's a lot of great modern patterns out there that are either actually fitted to my size or that I can adjust pretty easily with gauge. However, I do love vintage looks. And finding vintage clothes that are going to fit a 42-inch bust and nip in where I want to is pretty daunting. It's a very rare thing, as a matter of fact. So that's what kind of got me looking into vintage patterns in the first place, because I was wanting a pretty red dress, and I found this pattern. This is a dress from the 1950s. It's made of organza ribbon, also known as organdy ribbon. And I found this pattern and I thought, that's beautiful. I love it. I've got a petticoat that'll fit under it. It's going to be great. But then I started looking at more patterns and more patterns and more patterns. And there's a lot of stuff that I like about vintage crochet patterns for clothing. Part of it, like I said, is just the aesthetic. Like this cardigan that I found on my Vintage Wish on Etsy. I just like the look of it. I like the shape of the shoulders. I like the little pocket. I love the little waistband. I just think it's very cute. In the case of this sweater, which is also from the 30s, I just love that color work. I always love a bit of color work, and I mentioned in an earlier video that one of my goals this year is to practice my skills. And this is a great way to practice my color skills, because this is going to make me have to concentrate and learn to be a little more patient with my color work, which is never a bad thing. Then you get items like this, which is this fun pinwheel sort of dress with all this fringe. I don't think I'm actually going to use all the fringe, but I definitely love the look of the dress itself. I think that it's a very classic sort of cut. It's got a cool detail in how the pinwheels look. And then the thing that really broke me in terms of falling in love with vintage patterns was this two-piece crochet dress, which I hope you can see all of the striping work in there. And this is from the 30s. This is a very classic silhouette of the 30s with the two-piece suit. But the thing I love the most about it is that I can tell from looking at it that I can take the blouse and just keep adding the skirt and make it one piece and cut it off where I want to cut it off so I have a shorter skirt. Or I can make the skirt and have the two separate pieces and have a very smart outfit. There are other things that I found that I think are really interesting. There's really cute home stuff like this hanging gardens collection that I got that includes this fake ivy. I am a noted plant killer. So fake plants are great for me, and this reminds me so much of plants I saw like at my grandma's house growing up. There's also this ridiculous cushion set that looks like a big burger, which makes me chuckle, and it gives me a reason to work with foam again, which I did some last year and I want to do some more of. And I just also like stuff like this. Like if you've ever looked at Twinkie Chan's book, which I reviewed a while ago, that whole book is kind of food themed stuff for the home, and there's a big donut floor poof. I will link to that review at the end of the video so that you can go and look at it if you want. And this reminds me of that, and I would love to have a giant cheeseburger in my house. And then the other thing I found that I thought was phenomenal was that there's more than one crochet bra out there. And my bras are very expensive and I can barely wear them because they give me migraines, because I have a lot of boob. But like, I also would love to make something like this and see what I could learn about structure. You know, if I make this to my measurements, is this actually going to fit all my boob, and is it going to be comfortable? Like, who knows? Maybe what I need is a bunch of crocheted bras. But it's still just going to be fun to do. And then this one is just, I saw that it was a crochet garter, and I was like, that's getting made. I've got to do it. It's just such a perfect oddity compared to modern crochet. And, you know, I found a lot of other things that are very common in modern crochet. I found sock patterns. I found some tight patterns. I've found a number of purses and hats, you know, stuff that we still make, but they're in that vintage style. But when you're working with vintage patterns, there is some stuff that is a bit difficult. So one of them is that a lot of these patterns are made with thread or fingering weight yarn. So it's thread, lace, fingering weight yarn, all very popular when working with a lot of these patterns. And I understand why, because it gives you a great deal of control of your sizing. You have a lot more room to adjust sizing. It also allows you to do the kind of detail like you saw in that sweater picture, like you can see in the two-piece suit. You know, if you go digging around the Free Vintage Crochet website and look at the purses and a lot of this, and like a lot of the stuff for like the vanities and stuff, you can see really detailed work, which I think is phenomenal. I love detailed stuff like that, where it just, there's something about it that just feels so rich and lush and, you know, very precise. But in order to get it to look like that, you've got to use the tiny yarns. So you got to kind of balance, do you want to use the tiny yarn and get that exact look, or would you rather maybe save your hands and your eyes a little bit? I'm willing to go the tiny yarn route. I'm actually working on a skirt right now that is being done in thread, but it is a diamond mesh, so it's not as difficult as if it were you know, being done in single crochet or a stitch that was closer together. It's a tiered skirt from the 40s. I'm doing a video about it. So that's one thing to consider, is that you will likely be working with a lot of smaller hooks than you might normally work with. The other thing is that a lot of these yarns don't exist anymore, because we're talking about patterns from the 30s to the 70s. So even going into the 80s, I've got a couple of patterns from the 80s. We're talking about patterns that are 35 years old. And while certain yarns have been around that long and maybe have changed names or changed companies, I just downloaded a pamphlet of a bunch of potholders from the 1950s that is by Sugar and Cream. And it's not Lily's Sugar and Cream, but it's clearly the precursor to what we all use now to make potholders and washcloths, you know, the big cotton cones and what have you. But that does mean you have to first track down what the yarn was and the size that it was to make sure that you're actually matching the size of what you're making. And And it's not always necessary to be 100% right about it, because, if you're using a 2mm hook and you're getting 9 stitches for every 2 inches, all you've got to do is that gauge swatch, and as long as you're getting that, probably what you're using is going to be fine. But there is some stuff where I'm working on a coat right now, and it's a 1950s coat, one of those huge ones that just kind of, it's meant to fit over the giant skirt. And I'm doing that with worsted weight yarn on a J hook. But I am doing it with double stranding the yarn because that is part of the pattern requirements, and that's what's giving it part of its drape and its weight, to have the structure and the extra thickness to be warm. Going up to like a bulky yarn to get that same stitch count per inch would not give me that same sort of texture and weight that working double stranded is going to give me. So you've got to kind of balance that as well. Are you going for an exact replica, which is more what I like to do when I'm doing these, or are you just looking to get it kind of close? Do you want a lighter coat and a bulky yarn because you're not double stranding yarn, which is heavier and it's going to, do you want a coat that maybe is a little looser in its interpretation? Do you want something that's going to be much more a mirror image, etc.? So the good news is there are a few places that you can go on the internet to learn about what yarns might work to replace yarns that haven't existed for who knows how long. So the first place is yarnsub.com, and you can type in the yarn you're looking for and it will show you dupes, duplicates. I watch a lot of beauty YouTube. They use dupes to talk about, like, I found a lipstick that's $5 that looks like the lipstick that is $30. So, and sometimes Yarnsub doesn't have a yarn, just because it's never been put into the database. But that's a good place to start. Purple Kitty Yarn, which is the owner of the free vintage crochet website that has just a crap ton of vintage patterns. They have a page that is giving you enough information about these discontinued yarns that it's going to be easier to match that. Ravelry, you can always try. I found some good stuff on Ravelry. eBay, I have found, is a really good place to search, because what can happen is people will recreate the entire label as part of the item description, and so you may be able to pull enough information to figure out how big the yarn you need is. So I'll link Purple Kitty Yarn and Yarnsub in the basement. And one last thing before I go from this video, I do want to recommend, go to Etsy, look up vintage crochet patterns, have a good time. There's a lot of stuff there to see. There's a lot of fun stuff. But before you get anything from Etsy, I highly recommend you go to freevintagecrochet.com and you look through their pattern library, because there are some duplicates. So there is some stuff on Free Vintage Crochet that people also have for sale on Etsy, but it's free on Free Vintage Crochet. And that's a good way to get started. By the way, if you click printer friendly version on Free Vintage Crochet, it'll show it in like a document, and you can just copy all of that and paste it into a Google Doc and it looks good. Oh, I almost forgot the formatting. So the formatting on some of these vintage patterns is a bit difficult, because they were being put into small booklets, or they were in newspapers, so the amount of space they had to write the pattern was minimal. And what they would do is just kind of squish everything together. So rather than having, row 1, row 2, row 3, it's just one big paragraph. There's not a lot of visual cues to let you know that, here's row 1, here's row 2, etc. And you got to be careful on that, because that can lead to, you think you're supposed to do something until the end, but actually there are more instructions there about repeats, about increases and decreases and all of those. I'm having a bit of a hard time right now, because there are patterns that I want to show you pieces of, and there's a question of what qualifies as copyright for me. Because a lot of people on Etsy, what they've done is they've scanned these patterns and then they put them in a PDF and they've put them up. They've made no major changes except to make them electronic. And they're making a copyright claim that I don't think is valid. But then there are people who have taken the time to take these old patterns and type them out into the modern format where they're more easily readable. And while that still isn't technically a copyright issue, I want to respect the effort that was put into doing that. And, you know, send you over to get the pattern if I think it's a fun project. So I'm sort of wrestling with how to talk about that when I talk about these patterns and recommendations I would make on working with them. Because scanning something doesn't make it yours. Like, to make something copyrighted, I'll spare you the copyright law talk. I got a long talk about that one. And I'm fine with these vintage patterns being put up for sale, as long as I can't find them other places. And when you're dealing with patterns from about the 30s up into the 80s, you're in a really big area of space where very few of these things are findable as electronic products or even printed products from their yarn companies. Because again, yarns change. There are issues with some older patterns being on Etsy that shouldn't be on Etsy. And yes, I have reported them because I'm that bitch. So I think that's everything I wanted to talk about in terms of like these vintage patterns. I think if you're looking for a challenge, if you're looking for something different, if you're looking for like a really exact look because you like a certain style from a certain era, it's a good thing to search. Just to see what's out there. Maybe don't make a list of them on Etsy like I have and then stare at it and try to figure out, you know, which 3 you're going to buy and then buy 10. Most of these patterns are very affordable, which is very dangerous, at least for me. So I'm going to go and get back to work on one of my projects that I'm making from a vintage pattern, and I will talk to you guys later. Bye.